It began as an adventure. Young travelers chasing the freedom of the open road across Australia's endless landscapes. But along the lonely highways of New South Wales, that dream turned into a nightmare. For years, backpackers vanished without a trace. Their last known locations scattered near the same stretch of road leading into a quiet, haunting forest. What lay hidden beneath the trees of Belanglo State Forest would shock the nation. A secret burial ground, the work of a meticulous predator who hunted where no one could hear the screams. Tonight, we uncover the real story behind Australia's most chilling serial murders. How one man, armed with charm, weapons, and a terrifying cunning, turned a paradise for travelers into a place of horror. This is the story of the backpacker murders and the man who became known as Ivan Milat, the monster of Belanglo. The Backpacker Murders. The true story of Ivan Milat, Australia, 1989 to 1993. The Hume Highway cut through the Australian wilderness like a vein of asphalt and heat, carrying restless travelers from Sydney to Melbourne. In the late 1980s, this was the artery of youth, a road humming with adventure, where hitchhikers with dusty boots and hopeful smiles waited on the shoulder, thumbs raised to strangers. But between those sunburned miles and the cool green depths of Belanglo State Forest, something terrible stirred. Something patient. Something hunting. The first disappearance barely made the news. In December 1989, two 19-year-olds, James Gibson and Deborah Everest, packed their lives into backpacks and headed south from Sydney to attend the Con Fest near Albury. They were cheerful, practical, the kind of travelers who mailed postcards home. When the postcards stopped, the world kept turning until weeks became months. Then came a discovery. James Gibson's camera and backpack found far from where they'd been last seen. No bodies, no closure, just an echo in the dust. Then, more names, more silences. Between 1989 and 1992, other backpackers vanished along that same corridor. Simone Schmidl, a bright 21-year-old German student traveling alone. Anja Habschied and Gabor Neugebauer, a German couple exploring Australia before returning home. And two young British women, Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark, best friends with laughter that seemed to echo through every photograph they left behind. One by one, they disappeared into the long grass of New South Wales. For nearly 3 years, their fates were unknown, until September 19, 1992. Two orienteers jogging through Belanglo State Forest, a quiet sprawl of pine and sandstone about 2 hours southwest of Sydney, noticed something strange beneath the undergrowth. A small mound of earth, disturbed and unnatural. They brushed away the dirt, and the smell of death drifted up through the leaves. The police arrived within hours. They uncovered two bodies, later identified as Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark. The details of their deaths were almost too cruel to imagine. Joanne had been stabbed repeatedly, 15 times, wounds to her back, chest, neck. Caroline had been shot in the head multiple times, the pattern suggesting she'd been used as target practice. Her skull bore the telltale marks of bullets fired deliberately, methodically. Forensic investigators swept the forest floor, counting shells, photographing bones, and tracing bullet trajectories through the trees. Whoever did this had time, confidence, and a stomach for horror. It was not a crime of passion. It was a ritual. In the following year, Belanglo would give up more of its secrets. In October 1993, a man collecting firewood found another grave, then another. Buried shallow beneath the pine needles were James Gibson and Deborah Everest, the first pair to vanish. Their remains were skeletal. Gibson's bones showed knife marks. Everest's skull was fractured. The bush had nearly devoured them, but the marks of violence remained. A chill spread through the investigators. This was no coincidence. Someone had turned Belanglo into a graveyard, one known only to him. The forest had become his companion, his witness. Within weeks, the search teams expanded. Metal detectors, cadaver dogs, helicopters. The air thickened with the smell of damp earth and decomposition. And then, more graves. Simone Schmidl was found first, bound, stabbed, buried in a shallow pit. Nearby lay Anya Habschied and Gabor Neugebauer, their bodies similarly posed, bound, and hidden beneath leaves. Each scene told the same story: control, cruelty, and deliberation. Multiple weapons were used: guns, ropes. The killer wasn't improvising. He was experimenting. The press descended on Sydney. Headlines screamed of a backpacker killer. Television anchors whispered the word serial murderer for the first time. Police established Task Force Air in October 1993, drawing more than 100 officers, analysts, and behavioral experts into a single, sleepless operation. The evidence suggested a local man, someone who knew the backroads, the forests, and how to make a body vanish beneath its soil. A man comfortable with weapons. A man who knew how to make people trust him. Detectives mapped every known hitchhiker disappearance along the Hume Highway, comparing routes, witnesses, vehicle descriptions. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that circled the same name again and again: Ivan Milat. While the police combed the forest, across the world in England, a man named Paul Onions was watching the news. He froze. In the televised sketches of the Belanglo suspect, he saw the face of the man who had almost killed him. 4 years earlier, in January 1990, Paul had been hitchhiking in New South Wales when a friendly driver pulled over. The man introduced himself as Bill. He was tall, dark-haired, and confident. He spoke easily, laughed even. But as the miles went on, the tone shifted. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. His eyes hardened. Then came the weapon, a revolver drawn smoothly from beside the seat. Paul's heart raced. The bush on either side of the road blurred. He was trapped in a moving cell. When the driver slowed near a clearing, Paul acted. He flung open the passenger door and ran, shouting for help. Bullets cracking in the distance. A passing motorist picked him up, terrified but alive. He reported the attack to police, describing the man and his vehicle, but no arrest followed. The name Bill vanished into the backlog of reports. Until now, Paul Onions contacted Australian authorities immediately. Detectives flew him back to Sydney to give a full statement. When he was shown a lineup of photographs, his finger didn't hesitate. "That's him," he said. "That's the man who tried to kill me." The man in the picture was Ivan Robert Marco Milat, a 49-year-old road worker from the western suburbs of Sydney. He came from a large Croatian family, 14 siblings, and had spent most of his life in construction, driving heavy vehicles and traveling between rural sites. Neighbors described him as quiet, disciplined, and occasionally arrogant. Those who knew him better spoke of his fascination with guns and knives, his collection of weapons, his obsession with control. He was a hunter in every sense of the word. Detectives obtained surveillance warrants. They followed him discreetly, noting his routines. He drove the same model of Nissan that Onions had described. He still carried weapons in the car. The puzzle pieces were beginning to click. On May 22, 1994, after months of preparation, police struck. Dozens of officers surrounded the Milat property in Eagle Vale, southwest of Sydney, before dawn. Armed units breached the doors. Ivan Milat barely had time to reach for his gun before being subdued. What they found inside his house would end any lingering doubt. In his bedroom, firearms matching the calibers used in the murders. A .22 rifle with a distinctive muzzle, identical to the bullets recovered from the forest. Backpacks, sleeping bags, and camping gear belonging to the victims. Cameras, clothing, and even a water bottle identified by family members. Every room was an inventory of stolen lives. Each item whispered the same truth. The man who lived here had hunted human beings. Ivan Milat was arrested and charged with 7 counts of murder, 1 of attempted murder, and 1 of armed robbery. He said little. His eyes, cold and pale, gave nothing away. By the time the trial opened in March 1996, the world was watching. Australia had not seen a case like this in decades. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, family members, and curious locals desperate to see the monster whose crimes had turned their highways into hunting grounds. The prosecution's narrative was simple and devastating. Ivan Milat picked up hitchhikers, disarmed them with friendliness, then drove them deep into Belanglo State Forest, where he bound, tortured, and killed them for pleasure, for power, for reasons known only to him. Forensic evidence linked his weapons to bullets and cartridge casings recovered from the graves. Fibers from his car matched fibers from victims' clothing. Possessions from 6 of the 7 victims were found in his home. And then came Paul Onions, the survivor, who stood in the witness box and told the world what had happened to him on that lonely stretch of road in 1990. When the defense asked him how sure he was of his identification, he didn't waver. 100%, he said. Milat maintained his innocence, sometimes representing himself, cross-examining witnesses with unnerving calm. He hinted that one of his brothers could have been responsible, but the jury saw through the smoke. After 18 weeks, on July 27, 1996, the verdict was delivered, guilty on all 7 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 18 additional years for his other crimes. He showed no remorse, no flicker of emotion. As he was led away, he smiled faintly, a smile that haunted even the officers who had spent years hunting him. Behind bars, Ivan Milat became a symbol, not of mystery, but of banality. He was not an outsider, not a mythic creature of the bush. He was a man who blended into everyday life, who drank at local pubs, who waved to neighbors while the ghosts of 7 young travelers lay buried in his forest. The question that tormented investigators and psychologists alike was why. What drove a man to stalk, bind, and kill strangers who had done nothing but trust a ride? The answer would never come, not fully, not honestly. Milat denied everything to the end, a wall of silence behind which countless truths were buried. The thick forests of Belanglo State Forest stood silent for years, holding their secrets beneath layers of leaves, vines, and shadows. But as 1993 turned to 1994, the ghosts buried in that wilderness began to whisper, and the world would soon learn the name Ivan Milat, the man who transformed one of Australia's most peaceful landscapes into a place of terror. The story of his capture would test the limits of forensic investigation, police patience, and human evil itself. Detectives faced one of the most frustrating investigations in Australian history. 7 bodies had been discovered in Belanglo between 1992 and 1993, all showing signs of brutal violence, gunshot wounds, stab wounds, and evidence of torture. The victims were young backpackers, most of them international travelers who had come to Australia seeking adventure. What tied them together was chilling. Each had vanished while hitchhiking between Sydney and Melbourne. By early 1994, the New South Wales Police formed Task Force Air, led by Detective Superintendent Clive Small. Hundreds of officers sifted through witness statements, vehicle registrations, and missing person files. They cross-referenced every lead, every rumor, every strange encounter along the Hume Highway, Australia's main artery stretching through the wilderness. Then came a small but crucial lead, a British backpacker named Paul Onions. Paul Onions had been hitchhiking south from Liverpool, England, through Australia in 1990. He was picked up near Casula, a suburb of Sydney, by a friendly man in a 4-wheel drive vehicle. The driver introduced himself as Bill, charming, talkative, with an easy laugh. But as they drove toward the Belanglo area, Paul began to feel uneasy. The man's demeanor shifted. His jokes stopped. Bill began talking about guns, hunting, and knives. Then, suddenly, he pulled the car to the side of the road and produced a revolver. Paul Onions bolted from the vehicle, sprinting down the highway as bullets whistled past him. He managed to flag down a passing car driven by a woman named Joanne Berry, who took him to safety and contacted local police. A report was filed that day, but it went unnoticed amid hundreds of others. 4 years later, after news of the Belanglo murders reached England, Paul saw the reports and knew instantly. The man called Bill was the killer. In January 1994, he contacted Australian authorities again, and this time, they listened. Investigators reviewed Paul's statement and compared it with other witness descriptions. The detail about the four-wheel drive, the area near Belanglo, and the man's thick Australian accent matched multiple missing persons cases. Detective Clive Small's team began examining locals with access to weapons and vehicles matching the description. One name stood out: Ivan Milat, a road worker from Eagle Vale, southwest of Sydney. Milat was in his late 40s, lived with his girlfriend, and came from a large, close-knit family. The Milats were known for being tough, bush workers, hunters, and fiercely loyal to one another. But Ivan's past raised alarms. He had a criminal record that included armed robbery, theft, and even alleged assaults. When police interviewed people who knew him, unsettling patterns emerged. Several acquaintances recalled him making jokes about hitchhikers who never make it home. One co-worker remembered him offering rides to young travelers and returning alone. The case that had once seemed impossible to solve was suddenly converging on one man. For months, detectives placed Ivan Milat under discreet surveillance. They tracked his movements, watched his home, and secretly recorded his conversations. He worked with the Roads and Traffic Authority, repairing highways, ironically, the same routes where the victims had vanished. As investigators dug deeper, the evidence began to pile up. Milat's girlfriend, Challenger Hughes, eventually provided statements describing his obsession with guns and knives. She spoke of his violent temper, his paranoia, and his habit of hiding weapons around their home. Still, the task force knew that to convict Ivan Milat, they needed physical evidence, something that directly tied him to the backpackers. That opportunity came when they searched his home in May 1994. At dawn on May 22, 1994, police raided Milat's modest Eagle Vale home in a coordinated operation involving over 50 officers. What they found inside was a museum of horror. The walls and closets were lined with military-style weapons, rifles, shotguns, and ammunition. But the most disturbing finds were the personal belongings of the victims: sleeping bags, tents, backpacks, cameras, and even clothing known to belong to those who had disappeared years earlier. Inside a closet, detectives discovered a camera that had once belonged to German backpacker Simon Schmidl. The serial number matched perfectly. It was the breakthrough they needed. Meanwhile, at another property belonging to Milat's mother, police uncovered additional camping gear and firearms. The evidence trail was undeniable. Ivan Milat was arrested that morning and charged with the murders of the 7 backpackers. The trial began in 1996, drawing massive public attention. For the first time, the world saw the man behind the myth, not a mysterious drifter, but a quiet, ordinary road worker with piercing eyes and an unnerving calm. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence. They detailed the forensic matches between Milat's weapons and the bullet wounds found in several victims. They showed jurors personal items recovered from his home that were indisputably linked to the missing travelers. And then came the most powerful testimony of all, from Paul Onions. In court, Paul pointed directly at Milat and said, "That's the man who tried to kill me." His voice was steady, but the courtroom felt electric. For a moment, even Ivan Milat's expression faltered. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that others, possibly even members of Milat's family, could have placed the items in his home, but the jury didn't buy it. After months of testimony, Ivan Milat was found guilty on all 7 counts of murder, plus the attempted abduction of Paul Onions. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without parole. Even behind bars, Milat maintained his innocence. He filed numerous appeals, all denied. In prison, he became infamous for his defiance, hunger strikes, and manipulative behavior. He once cut off his own little finger with a plastic knife and mailed it to the High Court in protest. Another time, he went on a hunger strike demanding a PlayStation. Prison officials described him as cold, arrogant, and completely devoid of remorse. Investigators, however, suspected that his list of victims might not end at 7. They reopened unsolved disappearances from across New South Wales dating back to the 1970s, looking for connections to Milat. While no additional murders were conclusively proven, detectives believed he may have killed at least a dozen more travelers. Belanglo State Forest became a symbol of both fear and remembrance. Families of the victims often visited the site, leaving flowers, photos, and notes along the dirt tracks. To this day, signs warn travelers not to enter the forest alone. The name Belanglo still sends a chill down the spine of anyone who remembers the case. In 2019, Ivan Milat died of throat and stomach cancer at age 74, still denying responsibility until his final breath. Even in death, his silence left unanswered questions. Was there anyone else involved? Did some of his family members know more than they revealed? And how many victims remain undiscovered, lost somewhere in the endless bush? The backpacker murders changed Australia forever. It reshaped how travelers moved across the country, how police investigated disappearances, and how society viewed hitchhiking. It also redefined evil, not as a stranger lurking in the dark, but as a familiar face, a man who smiled at his coworkers and waved at neighbors before driving into the forest with another unsuspecting victim. The Belanglo murders remain one of the darkest chapters in Australian criminal history, not just for their brutality, but for the way they shattered a nation's innocence. Ivan Milat became more than a killer. He became a warning, a ghost on the highway, a reminder that monsters sometimes wear ordinary faces. Every year, new travelers still pass down the same stretch of highway, unaware that decades earlier, it was the hunting ground of one of Australia's most prolific serial killers. The wind whistles through the trees of Belanglo. The soil there has been turned, searched, and studied. But perhaps, deep beneath the roots, the bush still keeps its secrets. And if the forest could speak, it would tell the stories of those 7 souls, and of the man who once hunted them in silence, believing no one would ever hear their cries. Thank you for watching True Crime Spectrum, where we bring you real, verified stories that reveal the truth behind the world's darkest crimes. Subscribe for more deep dives into cases that changed history. And remember, stay safe out there.